We're back here on the platform this evening, and we are talking hurricanes, and with specific reference to the great Okeechobee hurricane of 1928 that claimed the lives of some 1,400 Bahamian migrant workers in the Florida area. Wayne Neely, who has authored a number of books, our guest on the program today. And when we were talking about where this hurricane actually formed.
It formed just east of the Windward Islands. It was actually what we call a classic Cape Verde type hurricane, which means came off the tropical wave came off the African coast into the Atlantic and moved throughout the Caribbean, and it came through the Atlantic Ocean, and it came all the way up. It affected Puerto Rico. In fact, one of the deadliest hurricanes in Puerto Rico. It was one of the deadliest hurricanes in the Dominican Republic, and one of the deadliest hurricanes in many of the Leeward Islands, Leeward and Windward Islands, Antigua, Montserrat. You also had St. Kitts, and all those. A lot of them had a lot of deaths from this storm.
Yes, but when it passed through the Bahamas, did it any people, any victims?
There were 3 persons who died on record. There were 3 persons who died in that storm in the Bahamas, and most of them were on New Providence.
New Providence.
Yes.
Okay, but it picked up the strength.
Actually, it was a Category 4 hurricane
passing through the Bahamas.
Yes, passing through the Bahamas.
Okay.
It was wind speeds of 140 miles per hour. And just to give you an example, Hurricane Jane and Wilma. Jane was, I think, a Category 1, which is about 75 plus miles per hour. And you had Wilma, also Category 1. You had Floyd. Floyd was, I think, a Category 2 or 3 when it passed through the Bahamas. We haven't had a Category 4 hurricane other than Andrew. Prior to Andrew, we didn't have one since the 1929 hurricane. So 1930 Abaco hurricane.
So before the 28, 29.
Yes.
Those were the big hurricanes.
Those are correct, and that's why I used the word great. Great is not a storm that I emphasize sell book, but it was a term that they used once wind speeds, sustained wind speeds reached 136 miles per hour or greater.
Okay.
So all of my books were Category 4 storms so far on record.
What would cause the wind speed to get to that velocity?
Well, for one, the Cape Verde type hurricanes tend to be the stronger times. We have about 4 different types of hurricanes in the North Atlantic that impact us in such way, and the characteristics and the intensity and the formation areas are totally different. The Cape Verde type is the most dangerous one because it comes off the African coast, comes through the warm Atlantic, and it picks up speed, picks up intensity. It has a long way to get before it reaches any significant landmass, so it picks up intensity throughout the Atlantic Ocean and feeds off the warm waters. And when it hits the Windward or Leeward Islands, you basically get either Category 4 or Category 5 storms at that time, and in this case it was a Category 4.
Now those 1,400 people who died in Okeechobee, they perished because of the type places they were living in.
Yeah, they were living in substandard housing.
Probably thatched,
yes, yeah, thatched, yes, and corrugated metal for roof, and that's basically about it. And I remember talking to Clifford. He told me about how the working conditions in Florida was so bad that he actually, once he got there, he realized how bad it was. He left and came back, so he couldn't live in that. But the average person, they endure that so that they can send money back home to their family. And so you didn't have, you had definitely substandard houses. So with a Category 4 storm, it did a lot of devastation, and also the flood waters from Okeechobee, it flooded the eye of the hurricane went over Okeechobee region, and instead of it actually dying out, it basically gained intensity once it hit the warm waters of the Okeechobee, and it swelled. All the surrounding communities were washed away in the storm. So a lot of them died from drowning.
From drowning?
Yes, from the lake itself, yeah.
Okay.
The lake surge.
Yes. Now, when the hurricane passed through the Bahamas, the same hurricane,
yes,
was it also a Category 4?
Yes, it was a Category 4.
Okay. And in 1928, you had substandard housing in New Providence,
yes, New Providence
as well.
Right. And that's why, for example, in the 1929 hurricane, I think you had like 600 houses were destroyed, and just in Nassau alone. And it's the same thing in Okeechobee. You had hundreds of the houses were destroyed. It was a normal thing. Once you had a hurricane, they built it. The storm destroyed the building. They simply the next day they built again. For example, in the 1926 hurricane season, you had the Nassau hurricane of 1926. It destroyed the entire Bahamas, devastated the entire Bahamas. They rebuilt their homes, and September came. The Great Miami hurricane destroyed the homes again, and they built it up again. Hurricane number 10 destroyed it, and most of the reports say they stopped building because they want to make sure that God don't have no other storm for them. So, but it was a normal time for the houses were not pretty standard like we have now.
Yes, because they were building with thatch roofs.
Thatch roofs and they simply went thatch roofs or corrugated zinc metal.
Yeah.
And if that was the case, they simply went in the pine yard, get some more thatch roof, and came back and built another roof.
And rebuilt.
Yes.
And so it was easy for a storm to carry.
Yes, to carry the entire building.
The entire building, and these storms carried hundreds of them at a time.
Yes, hundreds, and every one of them. That's why.
And there weren't any hurricane shelters, so to speak.
No, there were no hurricane shelters, and many of them would either try and go to some of the churches, or in some cases, some of them even went in caves. Especially in South Andres, there was a cave that the locals told me that they went in whenever there's a major hurricane. It was called the lumber hole, and they would go in that. They went in 1926 hurricane, 1928 hurricane, 1929 hurricane, and the 1932 and 33 hurricanes.
Those were years of deep poverty.
Yes.
In the entire Bahamas.
Yes. Yeah.
From one end to the next.
Yes. And sponging was the number one. And back then, the average sponge, they didn't make any money. The only time they went out at sea, they credited most of their stuff, so they didn't have money to go back. So that was the only thing that they had. They had no deep pockets, so they had to rely on the thatch palm roofs, go in the pine yards and get the roof, and came back and built them, and they built their homes. And in many cases, it was their form of survival for them, for hurricanes.
And the colonial government didn't do too much for them in those days, eh?
No, except the 1929 hurricane. I think what they did in 1929 and 1926 hurricane, because a lot of persons who died, because most of the men were being sponged. During this time, 1920, that was an era of sponging. That was the number one industry in the Bahamas. So a lot of them were caught in the storm, and they succumbed to the storm. So what the colonial government did, they built the widows' homes back at a small fee, at a very minimum fee. And in many cases, some of them, they said even with that fee, they couldn't afford it. So the colonial government built the homes. And only two records I find, in 1926 and the 1929 hurricane, where they rebuilt the homes back.
What would have been the impact of the sponging industry? And how was the sponging industry impacted by these hurricanes that pass through the Bahamas so regularly? These great hurricanes.
Well,
26, 29.
20 and 99.
Yes.
It would devastate the sponging industry. In most cases, for example, in this storm, I think there was 300 sponge vessels, I think, were destroyed in this storm itself. And a lot of them went out at sea, and they would go sometimes for 6 weeks at a time to go in the area of the mud, which is the western coast of Andres, and sometimes the storm would catch them. And back then, they didn't have the luxury that we have. We have computers, we have radio, we have thing.
They had
a barometer, and they would look at the barometer. Once there's a steep drop in pressure, then they would make their way back to land and try to get back to mainland.
If they were able to read.
Many times sometimes the storm caught them actually on the sea.
Yes.
And in many cases, they died in the storm.
Because they were unable to interpret what the barometer was saying.
Yes, and it was a new thing, and that was the only way to want. And they also looked at the seabirds. They noticed that once there was a hurricane on the way, they would see the seabirds go. Instead of normally, from experience, in the mornings the seabirds would come back into land, gather their berries, and go back out to sea. And they noticed that, let's say during the midday or during the afternoon, they see the seabirds coming back, and they realize that, look, there's some kind of bad weather passing this year. So
seabirds coming back to land.
Yes, and they would make preparations like that, and that's one of the ways that they knew. And the commissioner at the time on most of the islands had a barometer, And if he noticed a steep drop in pressure, he would go around informing residents that they should make preparations. There's a storm coming.
Obviously, they didn't have too much warning
No.
in the Florida area in 1928, because I don't know if they had the barometer in the fields
Yes. No, they didn't. No.
of Florida.
But actually, what happened with the storm, the weather observers, the weather reporters, they actually, up to 24 hours, they said the storm is not going to impact. It's not going to impact Florida. What happened was in 1926, you had a great boom, a real estate boom from 1924 to 1926 in Florida, and the hurricane of 1926, the Miami hurricane, devastated the region. And with the storm, they tried to downplay the storm because they didn't want, because once the storm came, it devastated the region. Many of those investors who came to Miami, who bought land, they packed up everything and they went back north, like to Chicago and other areas. And in this storm, they didn't want to frighten those the few remaining investors that they had for the storm, and so the weather observers said that the storm is not going to impact Miami. So within 24 hours, so after that, they realized, I think they never got warnings issued until about 12 to 6 hours prior to the storm arrival.
You mentioned the Coconut Grove area in Florida in
Yes.
this book, and you said that agriculture prospered in the Miami area along with tourism. Many Bahamian workers in the local citrus industry, particularly around Coconut Grove, a community where Bahamians lived since the 1880s. The Bahamian presence in West Coconut Grove gave the area's black community a distinctively island character that is still evident today.
Yes.
It was named Coconut Grove after an area in the Bahamas of the same name. The small community originally built by Bahamians became more segregated as the grove expanded and prospered. The descendants of Bahamians lived on Charles Avenue behind the Coconut Grove Playhouse.
Yes.
This would, the Bahamians who are in Coconut Grove, Florida today.
They actually relate. They can trace their roots back to the Bahamas.
Yes.
And that's why they named the grove. We have two: the white grove and the black grove. Right?
but Coconut Grove.
Coconut Grove,
is,
the grove here
is,
it was named after that. They named it after the grove in the Bahamas.
After the grove in
Yes.
the Bahamas.
And most places in Coconut Grove, even to this day, can trace their roots back to the Bahamas or Bahamian workers or the Bahamian migrant workers who was there at the time.
Now, this entire area was considered a part of Okeechobee? No.
It was further south. This
It
was
further south.
Yes.
Right. But Bahamians in Coconut Grove, Florida,
Yes.
were impacted by the same hurricane?
Yes. And don't forget, it was a pretty large hurricane.
It covered the entire Florida area.
Right. So, in all those areas, they were impacted by the storm. And remember back then, even in Miami, even in Florida, in the United States, they never really had building codes either. They based their building codes on our building codes, which was developed by, the first building codes was developed by a man by the name of Herbert Saffer. Herbert Saffer contributed to the Bahamian building codes. He took that idea to the Americans. The Americans turned it down, said they don't need a building code. And he drafted the first Bahamian legislation for hurricane building codes. And what ended up happening is that the Americans actually came to the Bahamas to get idea on what to put in their building codes. And after Andrew, they strengthened it even further. They reevaluated what we had and re-strengthened it based on that.
Herbert Hoover was president of the United States at the time.
Right, yes.
And there is something called the Herbert Hoover Dike.
Yes.
Yes. Tell us about that.
Yeah, what happened is because that happened, because the storm came over Okeechobee and flooded the region, one of the things that Herbert Hoover did was had the Army Corps of Engineers build a dike around the entire lake. And because of that, so to prevent further disasters like that from happening again, and they applied that same engineering technology to Louisiana and many of the other areas as well.
Yes.
And because of the same hurricane.
Yes, because of the Okeechobee hurricane,
yes.
They built the walls around Louisiana and New Orleans.
New Orleans, yes.
Yes.
And that's one of the things that it was built from 1928, so that's one of the reasons why it gave way. It was an old dike, so the waters basically washed the dikes away.
And the same thing happened in New Orleans.
Yes, and it built up, and they built it up higher now. So they said hopefully it should hold with any hurricane, with even a Category 5 hurricane.
Okay, let's take another break here. We are talking about the great hurricane of 1928 called the Great Okeechobee Hurricane with Wayne Neely. We'll come right back.